On an ordinary afternoon, a woman walked into a luxury car dealership. She was dressed simply, an old coat, worn shoes, and the quiet dignity of someone who had lived through storms. To the salesman, she was invisible. Just another person wasting their time, asking about cars far beyond her reach. They smirked, whispered behind her back, and finally told her outright, this place isn't for people like you. Humiliated, she left the showroom as laughter trailed behind her. But what no one in that dealership knew was her story. She wasn't just a simple woman. She was the widow of a decorated veteran, a man who had sacrificed everything on the battlefield so others could live. She carried with her not only his memory but also the weight of a promise she made long ago. The very next day, she would walk back into that same dealership. And when she did, jaws would drop. Because she wasn't there to buy one car, she was there to buy 50. This isn't just a story about wealth. It's about dignity, respect, and the unseen power of forgotten heroes whose sacrifices echo through generations. The day she walked into the dealership, the woman's name was Margaret Hale. To most, she looked like any elderly widow in town. Quiet, modest, and almost invisible. Her grey hair was tied back in a bun, and her coat was the same one she had worn for years. She didn't wear diamonds, didn't carry a designer purse, and her shoes showed the long miles she had walked. To the world, she was just another woman. But behind her gentle appearance was a story no showroom salesman could ever guess. Margaret had lived through sacrifice most people couldn't imagine. Her late husband, Captain Daniel Hale, had served with distinction in the U.S. Army. He was one of those real war heroes whose name rarely made headlines but whose bravery had saved lives in silence. Daniel had led men through fire, crossing battlefields where courage was tested every second. He had been decorated for his actions, an unsung hero who never asked for recognition, only that his soldiers made it home alive. Margaret remembered those nights waiting by the window, praying the knock on the door would never come. She remembered the letters stained with dirt from overseas, filled with words of encouragement from a man carrying the unbearable weight of soldier sacrifice. And finally, she remembered the day when the knock did come, and uniformed men stood before her with solemn faces. Her husband had given everything, his battlefield courage sealing his fate, his sacrifice leaving her alone but proud. For years, Margaret had carried that memory. She had worked tirelessly, never complaining, honoring Daniel's legacy in every small act of kindness she showed to others. She became known in her neighborhood as the quiet helper, the woman who cooked meals for other veterans, who visited hospital wards where forgotten heroes lay, who attended military tribute ceremonies even when no one else came. She lived her life as a walking story of devotion, a reminder of the silent strength of veteran families. But she also carried a private mission, one Daniel had left her with. Years earlier, he had spoken of his dream, to create a foundation that would help disabled veterans rebuild their lives. "If I don't make it back," he had told her, "promise me you'll carry on. Promise me you'll take whatever we have and turn it into something bigger, for them." Margaret had promised. And she kept that promise. Quietly, with discipline and patience, she saved every dollar from Daniel's pension, every cent from her modest jobs, every investment she carefully placed. She didn't live for luxury, she lived for purpose. While others saw an old coat, behind it was a woman who had built a fortune through quiet resilience, all dedicated to a mission larger than herself. So when she walked into that luxury dealership, it wasn't about cars. It was about choosing the vehicles that would serve as transport for the Veterans Foundation she was finally ready to launch. A fleet of vehicles for wounded soldiers, for families of those who served, for transporting forgotten heroes to ceremonies where their names would be spoken with honor. But the salesmen didn't see that. They only saw an old woman in worn shoes, standing awkwardly in the midst of shiny sports cars and polished sedans. They whispered, chuckled, and one of them, young, arrogant, his tie too tight and his smile too sharp, finally stepped forward. He said, forcing a smirk. "These cars start at prices you probably don't want to hear. Maybe you should check out the used lot down the street." The words pierced like a blade. Margaret felt the weight of every dismissal she had endured over the years, not just for herself, but for the countless veterans who had been overlooked, ignored, mocked. Men and women who had given everything, only to be treated as if their worth had expired with their service. She stood frozen, her heart aching. Not because she couldn't afford the cars. She could buy the entire dealership if she wanted. But because once again, respect had been denied. She left without arguing. Her dignity wouldn't allow her to fight back with anger. As she walked away, the salesman's laughter trailed behind her. To them, she was nobody. To them, her husband's heroic acts, her sacrifices, her mission, they were invisible. But that night, Margaret sat in her modest kitchen, her husband's medals laid out before her. She touched them one by one, the silver star, the bronze star, the purple heart. Each medal carried a story of battlefield courage and soldier sacrifice. Each one reminded her of the promise she had made. And as she looked at those medals, she made a decision. She would return to that dealership. Not for revenge, not for pride, but for dignity, for every forgotten hero whose story deserved to be remembered. She would walk back in, not as the woman they mocked, but as the widow of a real war hero, as the guardian of his dream, and as someone who had carried the strength of generations of unsung heroes. The next day, Margaret Hale would not come to ask about one car. She would come to buy 50. 50 vehicles, not for herself, but for the foundation that would honor her husband and countless others like him. 50 vehicles that would carry veterans, families, and stories of sacrifice across the nation. And when she did, the same men who mocked her would be left in stunned silence, forced to reckon with the truth. You should never underestimate the quiet strength of those who carry the memory of real war heroes in their hearts. The morning sun filtered through thin clouds as Margaret Hale prepared herself for the day that would change everything. She rose early, as she always did, her movements slow but steady. She brewed her tea, laid her husband's medals gently on the table, and whispered, "This is for you, Daniel." Her coat was still the same one from yesterday. She didn't put on jewelry or attempt to look wealthy. To Margaret, her strength didn't come from appearance, it came from honor. What she carried into that dealership wasn't a designer bag, but the invisible weight of promises kept and sacrifices endured. When she arrived, the showroom glistened with polished cars lined in perfect rows. Salesmen in crisp suits leaned against desks, sipping coffee and laughing at inside jokes. Margaret stepped through the glass doors, and the same man who had dismissed her the day before recognized her instantly. His smirk returned. "Well, look who's back," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Change your mind about the used lot down the street." His co-workers chuckled, some even rolling their eyes as if this would be another waste of their time. Margaret didn't flinch. She looked directly at him and said calmly, "Yesterday, you told me I didn't belong here. Today, I'm here to buy 50 vehicles. And I want them under the name of the Hale Veterans Foundation." The room fell silent. For a moment, the young salesman thought he had misheard. 50? He glanced at his co-workers, waiting for laughter, but no one laughed. Her voice wasn't trembling. Her eyes were steady. This wasn't the shaky confidence of a dreamer. It was the unwavering tone of someone who knew exactly what she was saying. He stuttered, 50. Margaret nodded. 50. Vans, SUVs, and trucks. Vehicles strong enough to carry wounded veterans, to transport families, to deliver supplies. My husband gave his life on the battlefield, and I've spent years preparing for this moment. You told me yesterday that this place isn't for people like me. But I'm not here for myself. I'm here for them, for the forgotten heroes who deserve more than this world has given them. The silence grew heavier. The general manager, who had overheard, quickly rushed forward. He was older, seasoned, and unlike his younger staff, he understood when he was standing before someone extraordinary. "Mrs. Hale," he said respectfully, "perhaps we can step into my office to discuss your request." The young salesman swallowed hard. His arrogance cracked as he realized he might have insulted someone of true significance. He tried to recover, offering a forced smile, but Margaret didn't look at him. She walked with dignity, her head high, following the manager. Inside the office, Margaret unfolded her plan. She spoke of her husband's legacy, of the veteran stories that had shaped her life. She described the Hale Veterans Foundation, a project born not of wealth but of sacrifice, built from years of savings and careful planning. She showed the legal documents, the foundation papers, and the funds secured for the purchase. The manager listened intently, his respect deepening with every word. He wasn't just hearing about cars, he was hearing about battlefield courage, soldier sacrifice, and the quiet resilience of a widow who had turned grief into a mission. It was emotional storytelling at its rawest. Meanwhile, outside the office, the salesmen whispered among themselves. Word spread quickly. Did she say 50 cars? One asked. For veterans? Another replied, their voices hushed with disbelief. The same men who laughed at her yesterday now stood pale, realizing their mistake. Back inside, Margaret finished her explanation. This fleet of vehicles will be more than transportation, she said softly. They will be symbols of honor, carrying real war heroes to hospitals, to ceremonies, to places where their sacrifices are remembered. No veteran should be forgotten. No family should feel abandoned. These vehicles will remind the world of what we owe them. The manager leaned back, moved beyond words. Finally, he said, Mrs. Hale, it would be our honor to serve your foundation. We'll allocate our best resources to ensure this order is fulfilled exactly as you envision. Margaret gave a small nod. Thank you. But let me be clear, I didn't come back for your approval or pity. I came back because yesterday I was dismissed as though my worth was tied to what I looked like. That happens too often to veterans and their families. They're underestimated, ignored, mocked. I won't allow that anymore. Not for me, not for them. Her words struck like thunder. By the time Margaret left the office with the manager beside her, the showroom had changed. The laughter was gone, replaced by a heavy silence of shame and awe. Salesmen who had smirked now lowered their eyes. Even the arrogant young salesman stood frozen, his face red with embarrassment. Margaret walked past him, her step steady, her expression calm. She didn't need revenge. Her dignity spoke louder than any insult. She stopped only once, looking directly at him. The next time you see someone who doesn't fit your idea of wealth or power, remember this moment. Respect costs you nothing, but the lack of it can cost you everything. The young man had no reply. As Margaret stepped outside into the sunlight, she felt the warmth of her husband's presence. She imagined him standing beside her, uniform pressed, medals shining, giving her that proud smile he used to wear. She whispered, "We did it, Daniel. The promise is alive." But Margaret's mission was only beginning. The cars would soon be delivered, but with them came a greater challenge. Turning vehicles into a movement, building a legacy that would outlast her. And in the days ahead, she would face not just admiration but resistance. From those who didn't want change, from those who doubted her, and from the shadows of her own grief that still followed her quietly. What began as a return to a dealership was about to grow into something much larger. A nationwide tribute to unsung heroes, a beacon of hope for forgotten veterans, and a reminder that true wealth lies not in luxury, but in honor. 2 weeks later, the quiet streets of Margaret's town witnessed something they had never seen before. Rows upon rows of gleaming vehicles rolled through, each one painted with the same simple emblem. A small golden star with the words Hail Veterans Foundation inscribed below. The dealership had kept its promise, delivering not just cars but symbols of dignity, rolling tributes to the sacrifices of countless unsung heroes. When the first vehicle stopped in front of Margaret's modest home, neighbors stepped outside, stunned. They whispered to each other, wondering how an elderly widow could command such a sight. For Margaret, though, this was not about spectacle, it was about fulfillment. She stood quietly on her porch, holding her husband's photograph against her chest, tears streaming down her face as the sound of engines filled the air. Veterans began arriving too. Old soldiers with canes, young men with prosthetic legs, mothers who had lost sons in war, all came to witness what Margaret had done in honor of her husband's promise. For them, this wasn't just about transportation. It was about being seen, being remembered, being valued. An elderly Marine named Robert stepped forward, his voice trembling. All these years, I thought people had forgotten us. We came home, and the world moved on. But what you've done, It tells us we still matter. Margaret placed her hand on his shoulder. You were never forgotten, Robert. Not by me. Not by Daniel. And never again, if I can help it. The emotional storytelling of that day spread like wildfire. Reporters arrived with cameras, capturing the sight of veterans climbing into the vehicles. Some struggling, some crying, but all smiling as they touched the emblems on the doors. The footage went viral across the nation. Commentators called it an inspirational military tribute, a rare moment of sincerity in a world too quick to overlook sacrifice. One of the most powerful moments came when a group of Gold Star families, parents who had lost children in service, were offered rides in the new vans. As they stepped inside, many broke down, whispering their children's names as though the vehicles themselves carried their memories forward. For them, this was not just transportation. It was recognition, something they had craved for years. That very afternoon, Margaret unveiled the Foundation's first mission. Standing at a small podium set up on her front lawn, she addressed the crowd. Her voice was steady, but every word carried deep emotion. These vehicles are not mine. They belong to every soldier who carried courage into the battlefield. They belong to the wives who waited, the children who prayed, and the families who sacrificed. The Hail Veterans Foundation will use them to transport wounded heroes to hospitals, to take veterans to ceremonies, and to ensure no hero is left behind at home. My husband dreamed of this. Today, with all of you, his dream lives. The applause that followed wasn't just noise. It was thunder rolling through the hearts of everyone present. For the first time, many veterans felt that their sacrifices were part of something larger than silence. The very next day, the vehicles embarked on their first mission. A group of veterans living in a remote town, many of them disabled and unable to travel, were transported to a long-overdue military tribute ceremony in the city. As the convoy of 50 vehicles moved down the highway, flags attached to their sides fluttered in the wind. Other drivers pulled over, some saluting, some wiping away tears as they realized what they were witnessing. Inside the lead van, Margaret sat surrounded by veterans. One of them, a young man named Lewis, who had lost both legs in Afghanistan, looked at her with tear-filled eyes. Mrs. Hale, he said softly, I've missed every ceremony since I came home. I thought I'd never stand among my brothers again. But today I'm with them. Margaret took his hand and whispered, You're not alone, Lewis. None of you are. When the convoy arrived at the ceremony, the atmosphere shifted. People gasped as 50 vehicles rolled in, one after another, carrying veterans who had once been invisible to the world. Soldiers in uniform saluted, children waved flags, and the crowd erupted in applause. The veterans stepped out, some on crutches, some in wheelchairs, but each one lifted by the dignity of the moment. The event turned into an overwhelming tribute. Stories were shared, real war heroes speaking of comrades lost, of soldier sacrifice that few could ever imagine. Forgotten heroes found themselves embraced by a community that finally saw them not as statistics, but as living legacies of courage. Reporters swarmed Margaret, asking how she had managed such a feat, but she deflected the attention. This is not about me, she told them. It's about them. Every vehicle you see represents a story. Every veteran you see represents a hero. If you want a headline, write this: a promise kept. A hero remembered. A future restored. Her humility only deepened the impact. Across the country, her story was shared under headlines like Widow Honors Fallen Veteran with Fleet of Vehicles for Heroes and Simple Woman Creates Monument of Wheels for Forgotten Soldiers. Millions watched the footage online, many moved to tears, others inspired to act. But for Margaret, the greatest reward wasn't the media coverage or the applause. It was the moment, late that evening, when she sat quietly by herself, the vehicles parked neatly in rows under the fading sun. She whispered again to her husband's photograph, They see them now, Daniel. They finally see them. That night, veterans who had long felt abandoned slept with a new sense of peace. Families who carried grief felt a little less alone. And Margaret, though exhausted, lay down with a heart lighter than it had been in decades. Yet even as she closed her eyes, she knew this was only the beginning. There were still more veterans to reach, more stories to honor, more battles to fight against indifference. The vehicles were the start of something greater, a movement that would challenge society to remember its heroes, not just in words, but in actions. And Margaret Hale, the widow once dismissed at a dealership, had become the voice of that movement. In the months that followed, the Hale Veterans Foundation became a name spoken far beyond Margaret's small town. What began with 50 vehicles turned into a movement spreading across state lines. Each convoy carried not only veterans but also their stories, living, breathing reminders of battlefield courage, soldier sacrifice, and the quiet resilience of forgotten heroes. Local communities joined in. Schools painted murals honoring real war heroes. Businesses donated fuel and maintenance for the Foundation's growing fleet. Churches, civic groups, and even bikers' clubs offered their support. Every journey the Foundation made became an act of emotional storytelling, a rolling military tribute that reignited respect wherever it went. Margaret remained at the heart of it all. She never sought attention, never asked to be celebrated. Her presence was humble, yet powerful. Veterans who once felt discarded now gathered around her, not just to thank her, but to draw strength from her unwavering faith in their worth. "You gave us back our dignity," one told her, tears in his eyes. "We thought the world had moved on without us. But you reminded us we're still part of its heartbeat." The Foundation's second mission took them to Arlington National Cemetery. A convoy of 50 vehicles carried families of the fallen to a remembrance ceremony. As they rolled through Washington, D.C., traffic stopped. Strangers stood on sidewalks, saluting, some pressing hands to their hearts, others crying openly. For those watching, it wasn't just cars passing by. It was a living river of sacrifice and honor flowing through the Capitol. Margaret sat in the lead vehicle, gazing at the endless rows of headstones that stretched across the green fields. Her husband's grave was there among them. She knelt, touching the stone, whispering softly, "Daniel, your dream is alive. And it's bigger than I ever imagined." For a moment, she thought she felt his hand on her shoulder, steady and proud, guiding her forward. News outlets covered the convoy extensively. National headlines called it a widow's promise that shook a nation. Commentators described Margaret as a symbol of love, resilience, and battlefield courage that lived on even beyond the front lines. Social media was flooded with stories of veterans sharing their gratitude. Some even called her America's quiet general, leading not with rank or weapons, but with compassion and determination. But Margaret never let the praise distract her. She often reminded her team, "This is not my story. This is the story of every veteran who was left behind, of every mother who wept, of every soldier who gave his tomorrow for our today." One of the most touching moments came during a gathering at a hospital for wounded warriors. Margaret personally handed the keys of a Foundation van to a young veteran who had lost both arms. The man struggled to hold them, tears running down his face. He said softly, "I thought I'd never be useful again. But because of this, I can help other veterans like me. You've given me a purpose." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she replied, "It's not me giving it to you. It's Daniel. It's every brother and sister you stood beside. Carry it forward." The Foundation soon grew into chapters across the country. Volunteers signed up by the thousands. Convoys began appearing in small towns and big cities alike. Forgotten heroes found their way back into the light, no longer invisible but honored as they always should have been. Years passed, and Margaret grew frailer. Her hair turned completely white, her steps slower. But her spirit never dimmed. Every event, every mission, every convoy, she was there, holding her husband's photo, smiling through tears. She had become a living legend, though she never called herself one. On her final Veterans Day parade, Margaret rode in the lead vehicle once more. The streets were lined with people waving flags, saluting, and chanting her name. Beside her sat a group of young veterans she had personally helped. As the convoy reached the center of town, a military band began to play, and thousands of voices joined together in unison. "Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, heroes." The sound was overwhelming. Margaret closed her eyes, clutching her husband's photograph one last time. She whispered, We kept the promise, Daniel. We kept it. That evening, she passed away quietly in her sleep, the medals of her husband on her nightstand and the Foundation's emblem on her dresser. She left not just a legacy but a movement that would outlive her by generations. At her funeral, thousands attended. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, saluting as her casket, draped in the American flag, passed by. The convoy of 50 vehicles followed behind in perfect formation, a living tribute to the woman who had reminded the world that dignity, respect, and honor can outshine arrogance and wealth. Her story became one of the most powerful veteran stories ever told, not because of grandeur, but because of its humanity. A simple woman, underestimated and dismissed, had turned humiliation into hope, and silence into a voice for the forgotten. Margaret Hale's name would forever be linked with battlefield courage, soldier sacrifice, and the eternal truth that the quietest among us sometimes carry the loudest echoes of heroism. She wasn't just honoring her husband, she was honoring every unsung hero who had given more than the world could repay. And as the Foundation continued to grow, her words remained carved into its mission statement. Respect costs nothing, but without it, we lose everything.